Thank you. I would like to
Thank you.
no? Yes. Well, the two previous presentations really make my job easier, and there are a couple of issues that I would like to start with. One of them is precisely Aromar's last point. I mean, get things done. How do we do that? And how do we address some of the issues that he illustrated so well in his presentation in terms of vulnerability and climate change, and what does it mean for the local communities? Where do we make a difference, and how do we get started? And for that, I would like to also pick up on 4 of the points that Jim introduced in his first presentation. One of them is leadership. The other one is think on the mergers, speak of people interests, and think across disciplines. I think those are key issues that will come across some of the issues that I would like to illustrate. I will move my presentation from the United States to, again, to some of the issues in the South, Global South. And first I would like just to very briefly talk about urban responses to climate change, and then talk about the situation in low and middle income countries. And lastly, I would like to concentrate most of the time in the relationship among vulnerability, adaptation, and development, precisely looking into that context that they cannot be dissociated, I mean, looking to this as a continuum. Well, in terms of urban responses, it has been really amazing during the last 5 years what has happened with urban areas in terms of responses to climate change, both in terms of mitigation as well as adaptation. And most of this is some of the list that you will see of what's happening on the right. The U.S. major alliances for climate change that bring together around 800 urban areas in the United States, 150 Federation of Canadian Municipalities, the C40 group that brings together the biggest urban areas around the world, the International Union of Local Authorities working on climate change, metropolis, an international organization. Urban areas in different continents are creating their own responses to climate change. IPCC is addressing the issue in more detail in the oncoming report, and international organizations like the World Bank, the Interdevelopment Bank, UN organizations, all of them are now looking into issues. The interesting part is that urban areas have been the missing link in climate studies for many decades. I mean, we've been working on climate change for a few decades, and it's not until very recently that this has happened. And to some extent, the dynamics of urban areas, the responses coming from urban areas have been upfront to what's happening in terms of international organizations, national governments, or regional organizations addressing the issue. However, it's interesting to note that this process, as recent as it is, have some concerns. And one of them is this very unbalanced attention to mitigation compared to adaptation in most of the urban areas. Few urban areas in low and middle countries are really taking part of this process, even though that their process of reducing vulnerability and addressing adaptation is not at a very extended level, and most of the time at the big areas, they have the resources to address this issue. Aromar pointed out the importance of looking at different gradients of urban areas to really make a difference, not only the big areas, but perhaps one of the biggest opportunities are not only in the villages, but also in the middle and small-sized urban areas, where most of the urban growth is actually taking place right now. There are very heterogeneous experiences, from very complex and well-thought responses to very incipient and very small responses. But all of them are labeled urban responses to climate change. All of them are labeled adaptation areas. And it's really important to distinguish which one of them are really contributing to adaptation and which one of them are really just taking the label and placing into activities that anywhere were already happening, but the people have recognized the political value of naming data adaptation, and they just stick the label to activities that were already happening. What we need is a very deep evaluation of what's the process is going on, and to really extract lessons that could help us move forward into a more efficient responses. The attention has been focused on large urban areas, and there has potential conflicts between mitigation and adaptation. I mean, and we need to recognize that a big part of adaptation takes place independently. It's not following the guidelines of the government, but individuals and communities respond on their own to adaptation. And often those responses could mean very different means in terms of equity, in terms of efficiency, in terms of conflicts and between mitigation and adaptation. The equity issue is critical, and we will address this in more detail in a minute. And finally, very critical point is that everything that we do in terms of adaptation, reducing vulnerability, or even mitigation, does not occur isolated to the rest of the social, cultural, political, economic, and environmental processes and that in society. And here is perhaps what I would like to come into more detail. How do we get to the point to really make a difference? And I would like to focus in the vast majority of areas, so those shown in the picture from Aromar, in low and middle income countries. Point of departure is that whatever happens now, as he pointed out, it's going to last for several decades. And the urban areas that we construct now will operate under different climatic conditions in the following decades. The critical point is that we are not considering how adapt are those areas. Are we making an effort to really help those areas adapt to those different climatic conditions in the coming decades? And the issue of natural hazards, I mean, I would like to distinguish adaptation responses is not only about natural hazards, it's also about helping communities become more sustainable. However, given the amount and importance of natural hazards, we need to really start by focusing on vulnerability. I mean, it's a critical response that we try to build, reduce vulnerability in order to move forward, helping these communities adapt to climate change. First of all, one of the critical points that I believe is important is the issue that strategies, policies, and projects balancing the structure and agency. And here, this is a critical area. Remember that the vast majority of these urban areas in low and middle income countries, urban growth takes place outside the planning framework. And that means that whatever we feel is important in terms of guidelines, standards, building codes that those urban areas implement in the future has a limit reaching people, because a big part of that growth is not actually taking place without the planning frameworks. However, we need to work with it, because it has to settle the framework within which urban areas can grow into the future. So what we need to do is to find a balance between what are the structural conditions that drive the urban growth, both in terms of formal and informal growth, and what are the capacities in terms of agency that people that build their own urban space, their own buildings, to find the middle ground between those two. And find the middle ground how we can deal with formal growth and informal growth at the same time through this balance between structure and agency. And why is this critical? Because a lot of what is happening is the immediate response by individuals and communities to build their own urban space outside the framework of planning. In order to do that, we need to combine top-down and bottom-up actions. And it's not enough to only have the guidelines, implement those guidelines, and reach part of the urban space that they can control, but also to find ways to provide the bottom-up opportunities, to work with agency of individuals and communities, to have the resources, to have the knowledge, to find a way to adapt to climate change and to reduce their vulnerabilities. And here the critical point is creating capacities, and capacities through communication, and very critical knowledge appropriation. We create knowledge, we work on the research. That knowledge has to be appropriated by those actors that really construct the urban space, both in terms of the formal and informal urban space. It's critical to create precedents. Many of the communities that we work with, they're eager to make a difference, reducing vulnerability. They're conscious about the importance on mitigating, of adaptating the communities. But the critical issue is that they don't know what to do it, how to do it, how to move forward. And creating precedents that illustrate what can be done, precedents like King County that Jim illustrated, I mean, in the case of the United States, but in the South there are other precedents that are very valuable. And we need to look into those precedents from the South and create the communication, South-South communication that help communities move forward. Critical point, and Jim alluded to it, and also Aromar, is the institutional development. And here by institutional development, I understand not only public institutions, but also other institutions in society. And working with communities is one issue, and again, working with the agency of individuals and communities, but also our planning institutions. Our planning institutions have been created, and they have a structure and operation way for the 20th century. And we are dealing with critical problems that surpass the framework for which those institutions were designed to work with. So we need to update those institutions. We need to find a way of communicating between different organs of government. When you work, and James' comment, it's interesting because his experience looking at the local government, it's important. But when you work with countries, you find that urban areas, as Aromar pointed out, they cannot survive, they cannot respond by themselves to this issue. However, there's disconnect in most of the countries. I come from Mexico, and there is a very important disconnect between what happens at the federal level, where all the resources are, and what happens at the local level. And this disconnect really is a major obstacle in finding how the institutions could develop. When we create capacities, those capacities have also to permeate to the public sector and to really help local officials to become empowered into making a difference in terms of reducing adaptation and creating reducing vulnerability and creating adaptation. Last 2 points is the legal framework, and we often forget about the legal framework. And here, this is a critical issue. Most of what can be done through the formal process of planning is regulated through the legal framework. If we don't have an adequate framework to deal with these issues, we are creating really obstacles to the process. The last point is the continuum between vulnerability, adaptation, and development. Vulnerability studies are really critical because they help us identify who has to adapt, where, and when. What are the conditions? This is one of the big challenges of adaptation. Officials often are confronted with what do we do? Where do we start with? Who should adapt? I mean, what kind of investment do we have? And a lot of that knowledge comes through the vulnerability analysis. And so reducing vulnerability, given the amount of disaster that we are confronted with, is critical, but not enough. And really adaptation is building sustainability, is building resilience, and moving communities develop. And adaptation is not a substitution for development. It's one of the components of development that has added to the situation. And these are some of the resources that we have in hand. And we have, of course, the national and local resources and initiatives. People are not passive victims. I mean, even when disaster attacks, people react, and they have a capacity to react. And we have to capitalize and really take advantage of those skills and capacity and knowledge to empower them to become more efficient. There is a wealth of urban studies that we really neglect in building the responses. When we deal with reducing vulnerability and creating adaptation, we're not starting from scratch. There's a wealth of knowledge that has been created in terms of urban studies that help us look into this. These are urban studies that have been created under disciplinary perspectives. But if we learn how to construct multidisciplinary approaches, we can take advantage of those resources. And this is one of the critical issues that we often forget. There are decades of experience in terms of development studies as well as development practice. And one of the lessons of development projects that we have implemented during the last decades is precisely that we don't extract lessons from those processes. Most of the development projects, either they fail or they success but there is very little attention on extracting lessons that could help us improve the following generation of development projects for those communities or countries. And this is an issue, this is a lesson that we cannot repeat, this is a mistake that we cannot repeat when we deal with reducing vulnerability and create adaptation. We need to have a constant feedback and learning process, extracting lessons in terms of what we created on strategies and projects to help us improve the next step of this. Adaptation is not a product, it's really a process. And such a process requires constant feedback from the different actors involved in the process. And finally, I just want to touch briefly in terms of opportunities in terms of funding. There's an enormous amount of, well, not enormous, there's not enough money, but there's some resources in terms of the agenda for development and for poverty reduction. And it's really a challenge for us to come forward and really provide different perspectives on how does funding, how does investment for development and poverty reduction can go beyond just the immediate response to poverty reduction or development, and consider incorporating into that process vulnerability reduction and adaptation as an additional component and benefits for those communities within those processes of funding. And finally, the expectation that funding through the Adaptation Fund will become available in the near future, in the future negotiations next month in Mexico, in Cancun. And this is one of the key issues on the agenda, and probably one of the very, very few agreements that could come out of that conference is the Adaptation Fund. And the expectation is that resources are going to be available, but communities, urban areas, countries are often not prepared to really come forward with efficient proposals to make a difference with use of those funds. So there's a lot of work to be done in that area. Two final points that I would like to form. Well, one is the conditions in urban areas and low-and-middle countries will continue to aggravate, and there is an urgent need to create responses to address this billion of people that are in those conditions. And the last 2 points is vulnerability and adaptation can become a rhetoric rather than operational concept. And this is a concern due to the fact that it's become a mode. This has become popular to talk about climate change. Everybody becomes interested in climate change. We've seen this before. I mean, we've seen this before decades ago with development. We've seen this before a couple decades ago with sustainable development, when the concept that was thought to be something, an operational concept, becomes really a rhetoric resource, and we lose the operational opportunities of using those concepts. So, with the attention to climate change, there is a risk that at the end we are only talking about the rhetoric element of adaptation, and we forget the operational opportunities. And finally, the role of the scientific community, and I bring that to the end because of this conference, the nature of this conference that bring together practitioners and the scientific community. This is a critical issue, and we often forget finding new ways to make our work as a scientific community relevant for the decision-making process. And there are a few examples that are very helpful on finding ways, and Jim represents one of those examples. Really, his work as a practitioner and bringing together science and decision-making is very helpful in that regard. But there are many other examples around the world, in the South as well as in the North. What we need is to really invest more time in finding bridges between the two domains of knowledge. One of the problems is that often the assumption is that knowledge is part of the scientific community, and we neglect the knowledge and the practitioners. And finding ways of combining those domains of knowledge and really creating valuable knowledge to have better capacity to respond is the key element in bringing more efficient responses to adaptation to climate change. Thank you.
So thank you, Roberto. I think we can take this time 3 questions, but quick questions. to Roberto before we take the last presentation for this plenary session today. Who wants to take the floor? Yeah, please, madam.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question for you. You talked a lot about responses to climate change.
Can you introduce yourself? Can you introduce
introduce Anastasia Sverezheva-Hopkins from Potsdam Institute for Climate in Germany. When you talked about responses of city system to climate change, of course you have to take into account some delay mechanisms, how the system responds, when the system responds to disturbance. And could you elaborate on this a little bit, keeping in mind the resilience system resilience paradigm?
Yes, of course. I mean, the resilience paradigm is an interesting framework to address the issue. And when I talk about urban responses, really it's a very heterogeneous area, because every city has a different process, and there are common elements like leadership, for instance, political will. There are key elements in the responses. Most of the cities, they have created climate programs, climate change programs. They have these common elements. They have a strong leadership by the mayor. The leadership has to come at the high level. And they have the capacity to bring together the resources and coordinate that at a very high political level. But in that diversity of responses, what we found now is that we are at the stage that the responses are so dynamic that we are running behind trying to understand what's happening and really find a critical view of that processes. And there are people here that have studied this in more detail. Is a key element to help us build more efficient options, and that includes, for instance, the resilience framework as one of the alternatives.
All right. Thank you, Roberto. Another question? Okay. So.